Welcome to another At Home with the Institute for American Indian Studies video series. My name is Griffin. I'm going to be talking about plants today, specifically plants you can forage for food. We're going to focus on one plant today, specifically cattails. Cattails is one of my favorites. There's a lot of different ways you can use it, but as I said, we're going to be mostly focusing on food. We're going to break this up into a few different chunks. We'll break it up into identifying and foraging it, we'll break it up into processing it, and then we'll break up the last little bit and maybe do a little bit about using it. We might even make some food with it too. So, why don't we get started? We can start getting some things together to cook. Right, so a lot of times you're going to end up finding cattails in really marshy, wet areas. So this seems not as wet as you might expect some of them to be. If you look out there, you can kind of see this pond. A lot of times you find them along the edges of ponds too. But just marshy areas in general are going to be pretty good. You can usually tell them apart pretty easily from other types of plants that you'll find in this area. This area being kind of the New England area, because they have some pretty distinguishing features, some of which here are their kind of reproductive body, which is the kind of cattail part. It looks a little bit like a hot dog, and it's on top. Now, this time of year, they're going to look like wet dogs. They're really going to be pretty weird. But when you break them apart, they get really fluffy. Now, this in itself is edible at certain times of the year. This time of the year, you're not going to want to eat this. But this is actually what they use for life jackets and boats. So this is a good insulator. It's good for buoyancy. But this is a pretty big tell. And these are actually just edible, kind of like as a thing if you get them early enough. If you wait till they're just about to kind of fruit, so to speak, you can actually collect the pollen as they're breaking open. And that can be used as flour as well. Now, the base of these is going to be different than, you can find Phragmites around here a lot of times. But the base of this is going to be a little bit different. If you want to get in close, you can check this out. Actually, never mind, I got it up. The base of this is kind of folded around itself. A lot of times with the Phragmites, which is the other type of plant that you'll usually find in kind of the marshy areas around here, there'll be individual shoots and it'll look a little bit bamboo-like. But the cattails, the plant part of it here, is kind of folded over itself, and you'll have different little layers here. Now, this was actually woven by native people in the area. You can make mats that you can cover buildings with, or create bedding with, or just create flooring with. So this has a lot of use in itself as well. This whole plant is relatively useful. But looking here, you can see that it's kind of layers upon layers upon layers, and it kind of builds outwards, and they're kind of spiraled. So that will help you kind of identify it when you see it out in the wild. So there's a few things you want to think about while you're harvesting. The first thing that you want to make sure that you have is permission to be where you are. You don't want to just go wandering on other people's property and just pulling up plants on their property. So always make sure that you check out where you're getting your stuff from and make sure you get permission for the area that you're in. Another thing that you want to kind of keep an eye out for is the fact that a lot of times swampy areas can be areas that'll collect kind of contaminants. So you might have areas that are pools that have runoff or things like that. So you always want to make sure that you're trying to collect from areas that don't seem like they may have contaminants in them. This being a marshy plant, it will absorb a lot of those. And if you get hungry enough, I mean, there comes a point where you just say, I'm hungry, I'm going to do it anyways. But always try and be careful for that. Now, the area that I pulled this stuff up from is a little bit bigger than probably a welcome mat. So you can get a lot of material just from a pretty small area. You want to follow the base of a lot of these kind of leftover from the year prior stalks down into the water, and then get down right to the base of that, and then you can tend to find the roots like rope kind of shooting in different directions from that central point. Now, some of it will be a little bit deep, some of it will be relatively close to the surface, but you want to make sure that you are in a position to be able to get to it. So you don't want to go too deep into the water, or you don't want to get into an area that's too rocky where you have to be pulling up stones in order to kind of get at these bits and pieces, but you should be able to find a pretty decent amount through those methods. All right, so we are here with our final haul. There's quite a bit in here. Since this is a little bit later in the season for roots, we'll see kind of in the processing how much we actually get out of this in terms of flour. But I pulled a few good examples to kind of show you bits and pieces from what it looks like underneath, now that we've kind of seen where it comes from. Most of what we have is going to look somewhat like this. This is the main root part that we're looking for. The plant will actually, the cattails will store all of its energy in here during the winter. So during the winter, when you are harvesting this type of material, you're actually going to get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of nutritional value in here. About this time of year, they're starting to send up shoots. So the shoots will actually convert a lot of the stored energy in here into plant material that's going to be used for collecting sunlight. The shoots are also edible as well. This stuff you can kind of cut up and fry up like greens, a little bit asparagus-like. Some of the parts here, some of these little bits there are a little bit tough. So the ends you might want to cut off, but all this base, all down here, all the white for sure, and then even up into a little bit of the green there, is all going to be really good. Very tender. As I said, the little tips, where it starts to get really green, it gets pretty stiff. But other than that, it's also going to be quite good. So we've collected a whole bag's worth of those as well. And then we have some that are kind of in between. So I have here some of the parts that are in the process of sprouting. So they'll have both the green sprout and then kind of the nutrient block that it's pulling from in order to sprout. This is where you're going to find actually probably the largest volumes of what you're looking for if you want to make flour. Now, if you just want to take these tips, and these tips will be a lot easier to collect than the roots will. The roots, as you saw, were a little bit underwater. Now, for reference, I'm about 6'2", so the water was coming up to about my knees, maybe a little bit less when I was hunting for these. But these will stand up straight, and so you'll actually be able to kind of spot them and pull them without having to dig down into the muck and sometimes stone, depending on where you are, in order to collect the roots. So both of these parts are actually edible, and depending on how much effort you want to put into collecting them, and depending on how much effort you want to put into cooking them and processing them, and not to mention the time of year, will probably change the way that you collect and utilize this material for food. So, the next step that we're going to do for processing this piece, these types of roots, into flours, we're actually going to break these pieces open. When you break it open, you can see it's kind of a little bit pithy, but there's a lot of starch in there. You can see the pieces went flying all over the table. That's all starch. So what we're going to actually do with this is we're going to bake it, and I'll show you what that looks like. I broke this one up into thirds, and then some little pieces there. And as I break it, you can see it's kind of turning to dust a little bit. I kind of got a dark background of a baking sheet here, so you can see that. Now, when we get to this point, I did this on about 300, 280, and just kind of let it sit for a little while. You don't want to cook it, you just want to dry it out. And then what I'll end up doing is taking these and using my mortar and pestle and just kind of grinding it up. What you're trying to do is get all that little dust and break that down, because that will become your flour. Now, as I said, a lot of the stored nutrients that's in these, as I break this up and kind of get this into the mortar and pestle here, is going to be used in the shoots. So part of that nutritional value is gone from these. So the further into the winter that you do this, the more flour you're going to get, but the less access to shoots. So you can kind of break this up with your hands, you can break it up with a tool, but in the end, I like to use the mortar and pestle, because the mortar and pestle will actually do the final parts that we're going to make it a fine grain instead of being kind of chunky. There's going to be a lot of fibers in this, and you're going to want to remove the fibers, and that will just kind of happen over time of you breaking it up. But you can kind of see that even just on here, it's starting to build up. And then once I kind of go through this and really grind this with a mortar and pestle, we will have flour. And once, of course, as I said before, we're going to have to remove a lot of these fibers. You don't want these fibers getting into what you're making. So you'll remove this, take the powder from that, put it back in here, keep grinding. And even just from this quick little bit here, you can see that it's starting. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to process a whole bunch of this, and then I will show you what it looks like when we are done with that. All right, so we have processed our cattail flour. Now this is a little bit less than a cup from that bag that we kind of collected earlier. Now, as I said before, you could end up with a lot more of this. If you do it earlier in the season, if you do it a little bit more into spring, you'll end up with a little bit more because it hasn't processed as much of the plant's nutrients that are stored in the roots into the shoots. So there's still more to get from. And we get a lot more if we just worked more on the roots that we have. We didn't completely get everything possible from them, but as you keep going, you're kind of, you get diminishing returns based on the amount of energy that you're putting in. So as I said, a little bit less than a cup here. What we're left with afterwards is a lot of this kind of dry husk. Now there's two different parts here. This is kind of the initial stuff that's left over. And as I said, there's still a little, you can get some from here. If we kept breaking this up, there's going to be some in there. You can already tell there's a little bit in here. But as I said, diminishing returns. Now this isn't useless at this point. You can still take fibers like this and create cordage with it. And people could create rope and string and things to connect stuff with, or clothing or whatnot. So this is not something that you have to throw away. There's always uses for things. And then the other part here, swap around, is this. And this is kind of the chaff that's left over after we grind all that up. I've used a sieve here that's used for flour. And I've used that and just run this through to get rid of all the little roughage that was building up in there that wasn't coming out in large pieces from over here. So I made a couple of things. The first thing that I made here is a stir fry, and this is made with rice, carrots, cabbage, and then I used the cattail shoots cut up to pieces about the size of my pinky nail and put those in as well. The second thing that I made here is oatmeal cookies, and the oatmeal recipe called for flour, and we substituted in the cattail flour instead of the regular flour. Thanks for sticking around to not only forage, but also process and cook with cattails with me.